Amen. Well, we haven't mentioned it yet, but you may have noticed that there's no baptistry pool open in front of me. Jill, unfortunately, is unwell and so unable to be baptized this morning. So we've had a slight change of plans, which means we're back in our Genesis series. So if you'd like to open your Bibles to Genesis chapter 48, this was supposed to happen next week, but we'll see what happens next week in its place. So Genesis chapter 48, the reading will be on the screen behind me if you haven't brought a Bible, so don't panic. But Genesis chapter 48, and we're going to actually read both chapters this time, chapters 48 and 49. Sometime later, Joseph was told, "Your father is ill." So he took his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, along with him. When Jacob was told, "Your son Joseph has come to you," Israel rallied his strength and sat upon the bed. Jacob said to Joseph, "God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan, and there he blessed me and said to me, 'I am going to make you fruitful and increase your numbers. I will make you a community of peoples, and I will give you this land as an everlasting possession to your descendants after you.' Now then, your two sons born to you in Egypt before I came to you here will be reckoned as mine. Ephraim and Manasseh will be mine, just as Reuben and Simeon are mine. Any children born to you after them will be yours. In the territory they inherit, they will be reckoned under the names of their brothers. As I was returning from Paddan, to my sorrow, Rachel died in the land of Canaan while we were still on the way, a little distance from Ephrathah. So I buried her there beside the road of Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. When Israel saw the sons of Joseph, he asked, 'Who are these?' 'They are the sons God has given me here,' Joseph said to his father. And then Israel said, 'Bring them to me so that I may bless them.' Now Israel's eyes were failing because of old age, and he could hardly see. So Joseph brought his sons close to him, and his father kissed them and embraced them. Israel said to Joseph, 'I never expected to see your face again, and now God has allowed me to see your children too.' Then Joseph removed them from Israel's knees and bowed down with his face to the ground. And Joseph took both of them, Ephraim on his right towards Israel's left hand, and Manasseh on his left towards Israel's right hand, and he brought them close to him. But Israel reached out his right hand and put it on Ephraim's head, though he was the younger. And crossing his arms, he put his left hand on Manasseh's head, even though Manasseh was the firstborn. Then he blessed Joseph and said, 'May the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked faithfully, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has delivered me from all harm, may he bless these boys. May they be called by my name and the names of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and may they increase greatly on the earth.' When Joseph saw his father placing his right hand on Ephraim's head, he was displeased. So he took hold of his father's hand to move it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. Joseph said to him, 'No, my father, this one is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head.' But his father refused and said, 'I know, my son, I know. He too will become a people. He too will become great. Nevertheless, his younger brother will be greater than he, and his descendants will become a group of nations.' He blessed them that day and said, 'In your name will Israel pronounce this blessing. May God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh.' So he put Ephraim ahead of Manasseh. And then Israel said to Joseph, 'I'm about to die, but God will be with you and take you back to the land of your fathers. And to you I give one more ridge of land than to your brothers, the ridge I took from the Amorites with my sword and my bow.' Then Jacob called for his sons and said, 'Gather round so that I can tell you what will happen in days to come. Assemble and listen, sons of Jacob. Listen to your father Israel. Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, the first sign of my strength, excelling in honor and excelling in power. Turbulent as the waters, you will no longer excel, for you went up to your father's bed, onto my couch, and defiled it. Simeon and Levi are brothers, their swords are weapons of violence. Let me not enter their council, let me not join their assembly. For they have killed men in their anger and hamstrung oxen as they pleased. Cursed be their anger, so fierce, and their fury so cruel. I will scatter them in Jacob and disperse them in Israel. Judah, your brothers will praise you. Your hand will be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons will bow down to you. You are a lion's cub, Judah. You return from the prey, my son. Like a lion, he crouches and lies down, like a lioness who dares to rouse him. The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he to whom it belongs shall come, and the obedience of the nations shall be his. He will tether his donkey to a vine, his colt to the choicest branch. He will wash his garments in wine, his robes in the blood of grapes. His eyes will be darker than wine, his teeth whiter than milk. Zebulun will live by the seashore and become a haven for ships. His border will extend towards Sidon. Issachar is a scrawny donkey lying down among the sheepfolds. When he sees how good his resting place and how pleasant is his land, he will bend his shoulder to the burden and submit to forced labor. Dan will provide justice for his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan will be a snake by the roadside, a viper along the path that bites the horse's heels so that its rider tumbles backwards. I look for your deliverance, Lord. Gad will be attacked by a band of raiders, but he will attack them at their heels. Asher's food will be rich. He will provide delicacies fit for a king. Naphtali is a doe set free that bears beautiful fawns. Joseph is a fruitful vine near a spring, whose branches climb over a wall. With bitterness, archers attack him. They shot at him with hostility, but his bow remained steady. His strong arms stayed supple because of the hand of the mighty one of Jacob, because of the shepherd, the rock of Israel. Because of your father's God who helps you, because of the Almighty who blesses you, with blessings of the skies above, blessings of the deep springs below, blessings of the breast and the womb. Your father's blessings are greater than the blessings of the ancient mountains, than the bounty of age-old hills. Let all these rest on the head of Joseph, on the brow of the prince among his brothers. Benjamin is a ravenous wolf. In the morning he devours the prey, in the evening he divides the plunder. All these are the 12 tribes of Israel, and this is what their father said to them when he blessed them, giving each the blessing appropriate to him. Now, most children at some point will speculate as to what they want to be when they grow up, don't they? For example, one of our daughters, she wants to be a builder. There's not enough female builders out there, are there? And the reason she wants to be a builder is because she thinks builders make lots of money. And I wonder if this is because in her formative years she saw our family being rinsed of cash as we paid the builders every week. It's very interesting to speculate about what children will be when they grow up. And perhaps you've done that for some of the children in church. Maybe you're thinking, well, what job will they have when they're older? Will they remain single? Will they get married? Will they have children? Will they go on adventures, live in all kinds of different parts of the world? Or will they stay in the same place? Will they be in Cambran in 60 years' time? Well, these two chapters are about the future. It's about what the future holds for the children of this one man named Jacob, who also had this nickname given to him by God, Israel. And by this time, he had 12 sons, but by this time, they had all grown into adulthood. So this is not merely what will they do when they grow up. They've already grown up. This is about what the future holds for their ancestors, for their descendants, for the tribes of Israel, as they are called. This is about the big picture of God's people. So this chapter, we're on to some pretty big stuff here. Just to give you a quick recap of the end of Genesis, at least, Abraham's grandson was this man that we've been introduced to, Jacob. He had his 12 sons through 4 different women, and family conflict arose because one of those sons was the favorite child, Joseph. He had these prophetic dreams even that his brothers and his parents would bow down to him. And as a result of that jealousy that ensued, 10 of his brothers at least, they captured him and they then trafficked him as a slave to Egypt. In Egypt as a slave, he served well, he gained a reputation, he got promoted, but then there was a false allegation against him of sexual misconduct, and that wound him up in prison. Whilst in prison, he was able to show that God could interpret dreams through him. God could use him to explain prophetic dreams. So when Pharaoh had these 2 prophetic dreams himself, no one else could interpret them, and they called for Joseph out of the prison. And because he said what he did, he interpreted the dreams, Pharaoh then made him the second highest in the kingdom, second only to Pharaoh himself. Now the dreams that Joseph interpreted, they meant that there would be 7 years of wealth, of abundance, of good harvests. And then those years would be followed by 7 years of austerity, where there would be famine, where the harvests would fail, where there would be no crops. And so Joseph was put in charge by Pharaoh of collecting taxes, collecting the crops in the first 7 years of plenty, and then in the 7 bad years that followed, he could then distribute the grain that they had gathered to supply what the people needed. But it wasn't just the people of Egypt, it was for the whole known world, and so Joseph, in that time, became the savior of the world, giving us a little picture of Jesus there. But then his brothers turned up on the scene. This was 2 decades after they had sold him as a slave, over 2 decades. They came because they had no food and they were asking for food. Now Joseph gave them a test to see if they had changed, and it turns out God had been working in them and had changed them. And so after a bit of toing and froing, Joseph reveals himself to them. He shows them that he was their brother after all, and then he brought them and their father, all of the family, down to Egypt to live there. And now we reach this part of the story, and this is the very end of Jacob's life. He knows that his time is short now, and so he's just rounding off his life in that sense. And in chapter 48, he spends some time with Joseph's 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. He pronounces these prophetic blessings upon them. And then in the next chapter, he goes on to the rest of his sons, the 12 natural sons, and he makes these prophetic pronouncements upon them as well, each one of them in turn. Now, the significant ones, we'll look at those in just a moment, but let's get the less significant ones out of the way first. And some of the details, some of what exactly they refer to and how exactly they were fulfilled historically, it may be lost to us or we may be uncertain, so we can't always know for certain what is going on. It doesn't matter. So, for example, let's have a look at a few of these. In chapter 49, verse 21, you've got Naphtali. We have one verse on him and his tribe. They inherited this land a few centuries later that was a hill country. So lots of hills in the region of Naphtali. So you can see why Naphtali is described as this skipping deer, if you like, on the mountainsides. That kind of echoes with that, doesn't it? And then the verse before that, you've got Asher in verse 20. Asher's territory was right next to the sea, and so coming in on the western coast, you have all these ships from all around the world with all kinds of delicacies and food. And so you can see how it describes Asher's food as rich, and some of that food that was brought in was then taken to the king's table, hence the second line. The verse before that, you've got Gad. Now, Gad was a border territory right on the eastern edge of Israel. And from that position, it was raided frequently. So you can understand why the references are given there, that Gad will be attacked by raiders. But Gad had to fight back and push back the borders of Israel, fight back against those raiders. And so it goes on. We're not going to chase up all of those tribes. If you want to, you could have a really interesting Bible study just by chasing up all of the tribe names in the Bible and seeing if you can see the allusions that are there. If you're doing that, you might want to, some Bibles have a map at the back of them. You might want to pull up a map of where the tribe settled or get one off the internet. It could be very helpful for you to go through that. But let's leave the more obscure ones behind. Let's look at a few other more interesting or more significant bits, shall we say. It's interesting that as Jacob comes to speak about Joseph's two sons, did you notice that he actually adopts them as his own? Did you spot that? So Joseph has had two sons. They're Jacob's grandsons. But Jacob says, these are now my sons, effectively. It's in chapter 48 and verse 5 that these sons will be reckoned as mine. But why does he do that? I mean, some grandparents can be interfering, can't they? And can almost take grandchildren as if they were their own, can't they? And some parents expect that far too much, but there we go. Why is Jacob doing that in this instance? Well, it's because Reuben and Simeon have excluded themselves, have discounted themselves. The writer of Chronicles makes that very clear, but it's also made pretty clear here as well. The end of verse 5 includes those two being mentioned, Reuben and Simeon. And if you interpret that verse a little bit more literally, it is implied that these two children of Joseph are replacements for Reuben and Simeon. You see more of the explanation in chapter 49, verse 3, for what has happened with Reuben. So from 3 following, right at the end in verse 4, it explains what has happened. Why is Reuben disqualified? Well, it's because he's defiled his father's bed. A euphemism there for what actually happened a few chapters before, when he had sex with one of his father's wives. So as verse 4 tells us, he is no longer going to be a leader. Although he was a leader in verse 3, in verse 4 he is now disqualified. He is discounted as the leader of God's people, the leading tribe, as the firstborn should have been. What about Simeon? Well, Simeon and Levi are then lumped in together in verse 5. In reality, both of them are disqualified, though Simeon has become representative for the both of them, particularly in the previous chapter, as we've mentioned. But why are they both disqualified? Well, they took revenge upon this people group called the Shechemites, because they wiped them out. They annihilated all of the Shechemites. The reason they did that was because one of the Shechemites had raped their sister. Now, their desire for justice was right, but the execution of that justice was at fault. So as a result of that, in verse 7 of chapter 49, there's this curse that is upon them. And then right at the end of that verse, they are going to be scattered. Now, how do we see that? Well, Simeon, as a tribe, a few centuries later, when they got into the land, they were scattered in that they didn't have their own exclusive territory. And instead of having their own land, their own portion of land, they had to take some of Judah's land. They had a little plot of land inside Judah's land. You can read all about it in the book of Joshua to have fuller explanation. So Simeon was scattered by being within Judah's plot of land. Levi's tribe, they were scattered because they were the priestly tribe. As the priests, they didn't have their own plot of land again, but instead they were scattered throughout the whole of Israel. So those are two of some more significant blessings that happen. Now let's get on to the most significant pronouncements. First, have a look at Joseph's pronouncement. This is in chapter 49 and verse 22 onwards. The gist of it is that he is going to be strong and that he will flourish as a tribe. That he will be blessed. Did you notice how much blessing of God Jacob is pouring down upon Joseph? You will be blessed. You will be blessed greatly. You'll be blessed with the blessings of the skies above, with the deep springs below. Blessings and blessings upon Joseph. So Joseph here is becoming the son of promise. He's inherited this superiority among his 11 brothers. The dream that he had of his brothers bowing down to him, that has come true. And that blessing that he then received is then channeled to one of his sons that has now been adopted by Jacob. That's how I think the line carries on here. That Ephraim takes up then the promise that is passed on from one to another. Now, did you notice that there's a little bit of confusion that goes on as Jacob is trying to bless these two sons? So Joseph makes sure his two sons are in the correct position. The oldest one is on his left so that he can get the right hand of his father, because the right hand is the significant hand of blessing. And the younger son is on the right so that he can get the left hand from his father, because he's facing his father. But as his father reaches out his hands to bless, he crosses them over. Did you spot the detail there? And Joseph doesn't like that. He tries to move his father's hand, but no, Jacob insists this is the way it's going to be. What is going on there? The older son there is not getting the blessing that he should have had. Instead, the younger son is getting the blessing. And remember that the one doing the blessing is a little bit blind. Now, if this isn't ringing any bells, well, you have to read back the rest of Genesis, because when Jacob himself was blessed, he shouldn't have received that blessing. His father gave the older son's blessing to Jacob, who was the younger son, and his father was a little bit blind at that time as well. So the same kind of thing is going on here. You know, God following the obscure path here of not going with the older son, but going with the younger son. Something significant is happening here, just as indeed it happened for Abraham and Isaac. Because the older son, the natural son, through the slave woman, was not the right one to receive the blessing, but the younger son, who was given by miraculous means, was to receive the blessing. So from Jacob now to Joseph, and now down to Ephraim, the line of blessing, the line of promise is continuing. There is a significance to Ephraim. There is a significance of lead and of rule and of blessing and of promise that is invested in Ephraim. But we might legitimately wonder, how does that work itself out in reality? How does that become part of history? How is this fulfilled? Now, some people, in trying to think, how is this fulfilled, they might look to the first king of the northern kingdom. Many hundreds of years later, after Solomon, the kingdom of Israel divided into two, north and south, and a different king ruled each region. The first northern king, he was descended from Ephraim. So some people see that as where this is fulfilled. But I don't think that is the natural place of this promise reaching its culmination. You see, the division of the kingdom was not a desirable thing. It wasn't outside of God's plans, but it wasn't part of his ideal, you could say. So I don't think it makes sense for this blessing to be channeled in something that was not desirable. But when you stop and remember, well, when was the book of Genesis written? It was written by Moses as they were traveling through the wilderness, trying to get to this promised land that they're all talking about in this moments of pouring out blessing. They're on their way to that promised land. They're looking forward to what they're about to inherit as these tribes of people. And remember there that at that time, as Moses was reaching the end of his life, there was someone else who was about to succeed him. Someone else who was going to be the next leader of God's people and who would take God's people into that land. Joshua is his name. Now, what tribe do you think Joshua might be from? The tribe of Ephraim. You've guessed well. Now, you've done well sticking with me so far. There's a lot of detail that we've covered. It gets a little bit technical as you go through this kind of chapter, doesn't it? It's necessary, but it is challenging. But ultimately, where I'm going with this pronouncement that is upon Ephraim, I'm going to Jesus, of course. So as this pronouncement is placed upon Ephraim, we're going to go and see that as a picture of the Messiah, of the Christ, of Jesus. As he was anticipated in all of this, we see the first picture that we have of the coming Christ as deliverer. You see, Joshua, where I think this is most purposefully fulfilled, Joshua's name means God saves or God delivers. So for Joshua to be named in that way, it kind of indicates that he is going to be the one through whom God delivers his people. And that's just what God did through Joshua, wasn't it? You know, as Joshua leads them in this march into the land, they're on the final step of their way, of their journey out of slavery, out of being trapped in a land that was not their own, onto freedom, onto deliverance in their own country. Joshua is taking them on that final step of being delivered. And he saved them from their enemies that were in that country by gaining for them the victory. He led them in battle to win the victory and conquer the land. And so they were delivered from their enemies by doing that. So that's how Joshua is the deliverer. Joshua is the promised deliverer from the tribe of Ephraim. But who does Joshua share a name with? He shares a name with Jesus. Now, the names are equivalent to each other, even though the language during the time changed. So that's why we say Jesus rather than Joshua. There's loads of quirks involved in all of that. But as we know from Matthew's account of Jesus' birth, Jesus' adoptive father, Joseph, was told that he should be called Jesus because he will save his people from their sins. It's appropriate for us to refer to that on the first Sunday of Advent, isn't it? Jesus, whose name was equivalent to Joshua, was called that because he would save his people from their sins. He would be a second Joshua, one who would deliver God's people. But rather than being from a physical battle with an army, he would save his people from their sins. So it's not a massive jump to see these promises that were given to Ephraim, then taken up by Joshua in the Old Testament, but then being completely, finally, fully fulfilled in Jesus. Now, what all that means is that as we see these promises of kingly deliverance, of God's blessing upon him and his people, we're to see them as met in Jesus, aren't we? He is the one who provides full and final deliverance. And he does this by bringing about the forgiveness of our sins. Like Joshua before him, Jesus is given the victory. He has given the victory over the devil. He has given victory over sin itself and over all of its consequences, including death. He has delivered. And that is for you and for me, isn't it? If we are those who recognize that this victory was on our behalf, that he has died to bring about our forgiveness, if we recognize that he has done that on our behalf, then he is our deliverer. He is the one who has saved us if we're those who trust in him. But there's one more pronouncement which is of significance here. And that is the pronouncement that was given to Judah. Now, do you remember how Judah could have disqualified himself? Do you remember that weird chapter 38? He denied his daughters the right to continue the family line through their brother-in-law, and eventually Judah had to be tricked into having sex with her in order to keep that family line going. But remember how God was using that confrontation and the tests of Joseph in order to redeem Judah. Do you remember that? If not, you can go and read it this afternoon. But having been redeemed and having been kept within the promise, he now inherits these promises of his own. So what's the difference between Ephraim and Judah? They're both inheriting these promises. Well, for Ephraim, there's this immediacy of fulfillment, this near future fulfillment of Joshua, as we've mentioned. But it's interesting to note that alongside Joshua was another leader. Joshua went with his friend, his co-leader, if you like, Caleb. Do you remember him? He was there as well. And which tribe do you think Caleb came from? Oh, you're so good at guessing. Well done. That's right. He's from the tribe of Judah. You're so good. Well done. So Ephraim, he provides this initial leadership of God's people fulfilled in Joshua. But it wasn't without Judah's participation with Caleb. But now we're thinking longer distance stuff even than just the conquest of the land. This is further into the future. And as we see it, it's wonderful. So have a look down at chapter 49 and verse 9 and following. First of all, he's described as a lion. Now, a lion, as we know, is the king of the beasts, so it's a royal figure. We think of the mane that they have, a little bit like my hair at the moment, like a crown that was upon their head. Verse 10 is where it really gets significant. The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he to whom it belongs shall come, and the obedience of the nations shall be his. So a scepter is the stick that a royal person will have as a sign of their rule, isn't it? So a scepter is going to appear in the tribe of Judah. In other words, in the tribe of Judah, eventually there would be kings. There will be royalty in Judah's blood down the lines. And further down the line, you might be able to guess what tribe King David was from. You've guessed right, the tribe of Judah. He wasn't the first king of Israel, he was the second king, but he was the archetypal king. He was the best king. He was the supreme king of the Old Testament. He was the king who set the pattern for what kings ought to look like, though he wasn't perfect himself. So King David was from the tribe of Judah, and in him we see this promise fulfilled that there will be a scepter that rises in Judah's line. And then it won't depart. So from David's line came Solomon, and then all of the kings that followed belonged to the tribe of Judah. But as that line carries on, we're waiting for one to come to whom it belongs supremely. Who does it belong to supremely? It belongs to Jesus. What tribe did Jesus come from? Came from the tribe of Judah. And so the second picture that we have here is of the coming Christ as ruler, as king. He is the one who leads us and leads us well. He takes that pattern that David set of how to be a good king, and he made it even better. He's the one who protects and provides for his people. He cares for and nurtures and directs us as his people. And as we submit our lives to him and follow him and recognize him as our king, so we flourish under his kingly rule. But notice the very last line of verse 10. The obedience of the nations shall be his. Do you remember the promise that was given to Abraham of this blessing that would be upon his descendants, but that blessing would flow out to the rest of the world? Well, the promise to Abraham there was taken up by Jacob as he blessed Judah and promised that the nations would come and would bow down to this king, would recognize this king and follow him. David and his son Solomon, they did kind of have this global reputation, this global reach as kings. But how much more is this promise fulfilled as it's taken up by Jesus? And he brings this international rule. It is no longer just the Jewish people who are called to bow down before him. It was never just the Jewish people, but how much more is it expanded outwards in Jesus? This is a global thing, a global reach that Jesus is to have as people from all nations are called to come to him and follow him, bow down to him, worship him, and submit to him as king. Look, this one is quite a technical passage, as we've mentioned. You've done well for sticking with it. But it does need careful thinking to get beyond this list of names and these blessings and the less than straightforward allusions that are sometimes there. But let's round up our thinking on this. In the New Testament, in Hebrews chapter 11, Jacob is actually commended for faith, for one thing, and that is for the way that he blessed his sons. Him blessing his sons in these 2 chapters, it was an act of faith. What's that about? Well, it's because Jacob was looking forward into the future for the tribes of Israel with eyes of faith, and beyond that as well. He was looking forward to this time almost 500 years later when his sons' ancestors in their tribal groups would receive the promises of the land that his grandfather had promised to him. He was looking forward to how even that was a picture of greater promises that were still to come. He was looking forward to kings, fulfilled in King David and then King Solomon and the other kings that followed. And then he was looking forward to one particular king, one deliverer and ruler, who was Jesus. With eyes of faith, Jacob was looking forward to the one who was to come, who would bring ultimate and final deliverance for sin, who would set his people finally free. He was looking forward to one who would create this international people of God who were prepared to be with him for all of eternity. What about for us? As Jacob had faith, so we too are to have faith. But whereas Jacob looked forward, we are also to look back. And people might say to you, how do you know it's all true? How do you know any of this Christianity stuff is true? How can you be sure that you really believe it? It's all such a long time ago, isn't it? I mean, the stuff that we're looking at is 4 millennia ago. It's a long time. How do you know Jesus is true? How do you know all of that 2,000 years ago? Can it all be real? Well, for Jacob, he was looking a long time ahead, almost 2,000 years ahead. And we're to look back almost with the same length of time. We're to look back just as Jacob looked forward. And we're to do so with eyes of faith. Just as Jacob looked forward with eyes of faith to be sure that it was true, so we look back with eyes of faith to be sure that it was true, that it really did happen. Jesus really did deliver us, and he really does lead us as his ruler. We need eyes that look back in faith so that we can then look forward in hope. And we look forward to how God might lead us in our lives, in the future that we have for him here on this earth. Through his designated ruler, Jesus, who rules our lives, we look forward in hope for what Jesus might do in us and through us. But we also look beyond that to the eternity that he has in store for us, for the land that he will give us in the new creation as he gives us the entire world as his new creation to live in and to thrive in as his people. We look forward to that time when we will be with God, when we will experience his blessing in ways that are greater than we can possibly experience in this lifetime. We look back with eyes of faith at what Jesus has done, so that we can then look forward in hope to all that awaits us in Jesus. Let's pray, shall we? Father, we thank you for these wonderful promises that we've seen in this part of the Bible. We thank you for those promises being fulfilled in Jesus, as the one who delivers us, as the one who rules us. Thank you that he gave his life so that we could be forgiven and set free from the power of the devil. And thank you that he leads us in our lives and will lead us to be in that eternal future that awaits us. Father, we ask that we would have those eyes of faith that look backwards to what is fulfilled in Jesus, that we would have that certainty, that fixed confidence that cannot be shaken, that Jesus really is the promised Messiah, so that we can then live our lives onwards for him, so that we can wait for that future that he has in store for us. Help us to encourage each other and to help each other on and in our lives of faith. Amen.